Power shapes empires, but what happens when that power is grown in glass tanks beneath an endless storm? The answer is the Commandos on Kamino. The rain never truly stops. It falls in thin, silver curtains against the durasteel platforms and darkens the ocean until horizon and sky become the same muted grey. In the dim training halls beneath that storm rose of light burn soft and cold over polished floors. The sound that fills them is not the roar of an army, but the measured echo of armored footsteps moving in unison, then breaking away into smaller teams in those long corridors. The story of the Clone Commandos begins not with cheering crowds or triumphant marches, but with silence. Kamino and eyes watch from high observation galleries as enhanced clones run obstacle courses in near darkness. Their armor is heavier, their movements sharper, their reactions drilled beyond instinct. Each squad is only a handful of brothers, Delta Omega, and others whose design would shape missions that never appear in public records while the Grand Army trains in bright open barracks. The Commandos prepare in shadowed chambers, learning to vanish into the dark and return without a word across the galaxy. Power gathers in secret. The Republic stands on the edge of war. The Sith move unseen. The Jedi sense a growing disturbance in the Force, but do not yet understand its source. Armies are raised without a vote. Lives are designed for conflict, and obedience becomes a currency, more valuable than credits in such an age. The loudest stories belong to fleets, clashing above worlds and legions, storming across battlefields. Yet history is rarely honest about what truly wins a war, because what followed was never just decided by the armies that everyone could see beneath the thunder of orbital bombardments and the bright lines of blaster fire. Small squads slip through the cracks of galactic conflict. These are the Clone Commandos, not the endless ranks on Geonosis, but the handful of soldiers dropped behind enemy lines to sabotage droid foundries, infiltrate fortified citadels, or pull a single target from the heart of an enemy stronghold. Delta Squad moves through the ruins of a crashed separatist ship. Omega waits in the shadows of Coruscant's underlevels. Gregor is lost on a distant world, remembered only by fading records. Over time, their work changes battles without ever changing parades. Tonight, the focus rests on them. This is the story of their entire life cycle, followed slowly from the first moment Kamino and scientists adjust the growth rate of a single cell to the last scattered years when former Republic commandos serve an empire. They never chose. What they found there would change everything for these soldiers. As the Clone Wars ignite, they will carry out missions too dark for official reports, endure losses that leave empty bunks in cramped barracks, and face orders that fracture the line between duty and conscience. The pace of this journey will be calm and unhurried. Each phase of their existence will unfold as a quiet chronicle, from rain-soaked training grounds to silent insertions on hostile worlds, from whispered commands over encrypted channels to the uneasy stillness after Order 66. When brothers become hunters and fugitives, in turn told as a bedtime history, rich with lore yet softened by distance. This long walk through their story invites slow breathing and closing eyes, letting the rise and fall of their hidden war carry the listener gently towards sleep, from legends to lullaby, framing the Commando's hidden legacy, told as a bedtime history, rich with lore yet softened by distance. This long walk through their story invites slow breathing and closing eyes, letting the rise and fall of their hidden war carry the listener gently towards sleep in that quiet space. Another layer of the story of the Clone Commandos begins to emerge, a layer woven from different tellings, different eras, and different truths, yet held together by the same marching footsteps in official canon. Their shadows appear in the Clone Wars, the Bad Batch, and Rebels, brief but sharp impressions of specialized soldiers moving at the edges of the frame in Legends. They live entire lives across the Republic. Commando novels and the original game detailed accounts of training missions and brotherhood in the dark between stars. This journey will move slowly between those two currents, naming canon and legends when needed, but never lingering on the distinction long enough to disturb the calm. Instead, the focus rests on the continuous thread of their existence, anchored in the wider galactic timeline. They are born in the storm and neon of Kamino, in the final years before the Clone Wars engineered for power, precision, and obedience, while the Republic still pretends peace will hold. When war finally erupts on Geonosis, Commandos are already in motion, inserted behind enemy lines, as the larger clone legions march into the light of open battle. Over time, as the conflict spreads from world to world, these small squads become the unseen counterpart to the grand campaigns where standard troopers fight in their thousands. Commandos move in teams of 4, slipping through ventilation shafts, cutting power grids, sabotaging droid foundries, and listening in the dark to enemy transmissions. The galaxy remembers the massed ranks of white armor under Jedi generals, but the war also depends on missions. The Jedi rarely discuss deniable strikes where success is measured in silence. Delta Squad steps out of the game and into canon on Devron, a brief appearance that hints at a longer Legends record of sieges, boarding actions, and narrow escapes. Omega Squad forms in the aftermath of Geonosis, a patchwork unit carrying loss and trauma into black operations that strain loyalty to the breaking point. There is Gregor, the stranded commando on Abafar, whose amnesia hides a lifetime of service until memory returns, and with it, a final act of sacrifice that would shape the fates of future rebels as the Clone Wars end, and the Empire rises. Those same skills are repurposed. Early Imperial commandos hunt insurgents, train new forces, and enforce the Emperor's will across a darkening galaxy. Scattered survivors slip through the cracks. Some vanish into remote worlds. Others resurface decades later, worn but unbroken from Kamino and training halls to forgotten rebel hideouts. What followed was an unbroken chain of choices and consequences, each mission linking to the next, each brother's decision echoing onward, quietly altering not only battles but the inner lives of clones who were never meant to endure. Blueprints in the storm. Why? The Republic needed commandos from those scattered survivors. The story of the Clone Commandos widens back out into the storm that created them before they were ghosts on forgotten battlefields. They were blueprints on a secret order form, placed at the very edge of a galactic crisis. On Coruscant, the Republic was fracturing worlds, threatened secession. Corporations whispered of profit and protection, and in the shadows of Senate halls, the word war stopped being hypothetical and became inevitable. Around the final years before the Clone Wars, the separatist crisis pushed the Republic toward open conflict. The Trade Federation, the Techno-Union, and other powerful blocs gathered under the separatist banner. Their droid armies multiplied in hidden foundries, guided by cold logic and corporate ambition. The Jedi Order felt the pressure mounting. The Force itself seemed to ripple with oncoming disaster. Yet the Republic had no standing army, no shield to raise when the first volleys fell. The answer had already been set in motion far from Coruscant, on the rain-lashed world of Kamino. There, the Kaminoans had turned cloning into an industry and an art commissioned in secret by a vanished Jedi Master. They grew a ready-made army from the genetic template of Jango Fett. What followed was the quiet construction of an entire military and darkness rose of identical soldiers bred for obedience, discipline, and rapid deployment, all awaiting a single order to awaken. But the Kaminoan design went deeper than standard infantry beneath the surface of that ocean world. Specialized lines took shape, ARC troopers with heightened independence and aggression. And at the very top of that engineered hierarchy, the Clone Commandos. These were not mass formation soldiers. They were precision tools conceived for missions that could never be acknowledged. Squads such as Delta and the future Lone Survivor. Gregor began as entries in a production schema, not yet names in history. Strategically, the Republic and the Jedi Council understood a hard truth in a war of numbers, and steel droids could be replaced endlessly. But some objectives could only be taken by a handful of living beings who could adapt in real-time sabotage. Enemy foundries extract high-value targets, assassinate separatist leaders before they could rally entire sectors, and vanish without trace if discovered commandos offered deniability. If a mission failed, it could be disavowed if it succeeded. Entire campaigns shifted quietly to fulfill that role. These clones were engineered from the beginning to be different, more independent, more adaptable. Their minds were tuned for problem-solving under fire. Their training emphasized initiative over rigid formation drills over time. This made them invaluable assets and quietly dangerous tools. They could question orders, improvise, and in rare moments, even defy expectations in a galaxy ruled by command chains that independence carried both power and risk. Their first memories would shape everything sterile Kaminoan labs humming with equipment, storm-lit training domes where artificial cities rose and fell under live fire childhood, compressed into simulations and squad drills until four-man units moved as one organism. The next step in their story waits there in the rain as the first Commando helmets are sealed and the doors to those training halls slide open. Design for the impossible. Kaminoan engineering and Commando genetics. Those doors did not open on ordinary soldiers. They opened on a refined template of Jango Fett rebuilt. At the genetic level, the Kaminoans began with a bounty hunter whose reflexes, aim, and survival instincts were already exceptional. Then asked a quiet question: how far could that design be pushed without breaking the mind? The answer was the Clone Commando. The baseline genome remained: Jango, his bone structure, his predatory awareness, his ingrained sense of personal honor. But within that framework, the Kaminoans introduced subtle amplifications. Muscle density increased beyond standard troopers. Micro-adjustments to tendons and joints yielded faster reflex arcs. Ocular and auditory thresholds were raised so that distant movement in a storm or the faintest scrape in a ventilation shaft became usable data. What followed was a soldier who could move through a battlefield as if time itself had slowed. Yet raw power was not enough. The story of the Commandos is not just enhanced strength, but engineered flexibility. In most clones, obedience sat at the center of their design, unquestioning alignment to the chain of command in the commando batches. That instinct remained, but it was deliberately tempered. Their neural conditioning emphasized pattern, recognition, improvisation, and small unit leadership. They were created to infiltrate enemy lines, operate cut off from support, and make independent decisions. In the dark, the Kaminoans walked a narrow line. They required absolute loyalty to the Republic, while also cultivating the capacity to violate standard rules of engagement. On demand, moral compartmentalization became part of their architecture. A commando might disable a shield grid, sabotage a city's power network, or quietly remove a single high-value target, and then step back into formation as though nothing had happened. This was not simple ruthlessness. It was a designed ability to separate mission necessity from personal, feeling their accelerated aging remained unchanged. Bodies raced from childhood to combat readiness in barely a decade. But the mind was tuned differently. Language centers were overdeveloped to absorb multiple tongues and coded dialects. Technical aptitude was reinforced through endless simulations of unfamiliar weaponry and alien technology. A commando could pick up a captured separatist device on Geonosis or Skako Minor and understand enough to turn it against a droid army. Over time, this breadth of training made them walking repositories of covert knowledge. Beneath all of this lay a quieter cost: being bred to be exceptional among identical brothers carried its own weight. Commandos knew they were rarer, more expensive to grow and train, more heavily monitored on Kamino. Instructors and Kamino and overseers tracked their performance with clinical interest. Success meant deployment to the most dangerous fronts. Failure meant reconditioning or disposal. That awareness lingered unspoken, a sense of distance from the vast ranks of white-armored infantry who shared their face but not their burden in response. The environment around them was shaped with equal precision. Kaminoan training regiments isolated them into tight four-man squads. From the earliest drills, each unit moved as a single organism, clearing rain-slick corridors, storming artificial citadels in the Thunder Delta Omega, and countless unnamed squads were not just teams. They were entire worlds to the men inside them. Those surrogate families would shape every choice in the wars to come, and the next step lies in following those squads out into the wider galaxy as the Clone Wars ignite. 4 against the galaxy, the birth of squad-based brotherhood. In the beginning, the design was simple: 4 men, 1 purpose in the echoing training halls of Kamino. The Kaminoans arranged their new assets not in endless ranks, but in tight clusters of 4 from their first conscious memories. Each young commando woke to the same 3 faces. The same 3 voices, bunks aligned in squares rather than rows. The story of their lives narrowed to 3 brothers and a mission around those sterile white chambers. Instructors moved in precise patterns, but for the commandos, the galaxy shrank to a tiny orbit. Every drill, every leave fire exercise, every simulated breach reinforced the same lesson. Survival depended on those 3 others. Nothing else mattered. What followed was a kind of enforced intimacy. They ate together, healed together, failed together when one was punished. The entire squad ran the extra kilometers until muscle and memory fused into one unbroken unit. This stood in quiet contrast to the great tides of standard clones elsewhere, on Kamino, in vast barracks stretching into mist. Regular troopers trained in companies and battalions numbers. Instead of names, they rotated between formations as instructors adjusted units to meet strategic needs over time. A broad sense of brotherhood emerged, a feeling of belonging to the grand army, to a galactic cause. But that bond was spread thin across hundreds of helmets and thousands of identical voices. For the commandos, the structure itself would shape their minds. 4 against the galaxy meant deep interdependence. Each man carried a primary role: demolitions, slicing, sniping, squad leadership. Yet every role was mirrored in the others. Demolitions experts learned to patch wounds. Slicers drilled with long-range rifles. Leaders crawled through mud to plant charges. The Kaminoans understood that in the dark corners of a war, a lost specialist could not mean a lost mission. Redundancy became a quiet form of armor. The emotional consequences ran deeper than the Kaminoans intended. Away from the parade grounds, commandos developed stronger individual identities than most of their kin. Nicknames replaced designations. Personal quirks were not erased, but refined. One squadmate might obsess over weapon maintenance. Another might quote obscure Republic regulations. A third might paint sigils on armor plates in defiance of sterile uniformity. The constant presence of the same 3 personalities turned those quirks into anchors in a life defined by conflict in time. The constancy became its own dangerous power. When a commando glanced left and right, he did not see the faceless ranks of an empire. He saw the only family he had ever known. Every order, every objective was filtered through the question: will this bring my brothers home? Some commanders found that loyalty useful. Others feared it could bend the clean lines of command. Soon the abstraction of 4-man squads will dissolve into specific faces, Delta Omega and others stepping out of the rain and into real missions under real fire. And what they found there would change everything: rain, simulations, and silence. Daily life in Kamino's commando training. They stepped through that threshold into a world of controlled rain and rehearsed thunder, a place where every sound and surface has been designed to shape them the eats. Interior of Kamino is all clean lines, and cold light long sterile white corridors stretch in every direction. Polished floors reflecting the overhead glow doors hiss open and closed with measured regularity. In the distance, the constant roar of the storm presses against transparent steel panels, a deep, steady presence under everything, while the soft hum of life support systems and training machinery fills the spaces in between. In the early cycles of their growth, the story of their days is simple. Wake drills, eat, train, sleep. Repeat obstacle courses unfold inside cavernous chambers, walls reconfiguring with quiet mechanical precision. Raised platforms, retracting and extending to form shifting paths. Commandos in training run those paths in perfect formation. Boots striking the deck in unison. Their breath controlled their movements. Economical instructors watch from observation galleries, their elongated silhouettes framed against data screens, noting timing, cohesion, and hesitation. Over time, the regimen intensifies. What began as basic coordination becomes live fire gauntlets with stun rounds, then lethal ammunition. Holographic projectors cast complex environments across the walls, ruined cityscapes, dense jungles, cramped starship corridors, each space filled with simulated hostiles that demand quick reactions and precise judgment. zero-gravity insertions follow entire squads drifting through darkened chambers. Their armor mag-sealed their visors, glowing faintly as they orient around rotating objectives. A misjudged push sends a brother spinning a well-placed hand on a forearm, brings him back into alignment above and around them. Kamino and overseers move with serene detachment, tall, pale figures discussing performance metrics in soft measured tones to them. This is an investment in efficiency and reliability. Human, and in some accounts, Mandalorian trainers bring a different presence. Their voices sharper, their expectations rooted in lived battle experience. They teach more than marksmanship. They teach tactics, angles of fire breach patterns, and the quiet professional ruthlessness required to end a threat before it becomes a wider conflict in their lessons. Hesitation is examined, failure is dissected, and improvement is mandatory. Between these relentless drills, there are small pockets of silence that feel almost fragile in the dormitories. The roar of the rain becomes a distant lullaby, echoing through the structure. Commandos sit on bunks or against bulkheads, cleaning rifles, adjusting armor plates, sharing stories, half-remembered details of training, mishaps or rare words of praise from a respected sergeant. Nicknames emerge first as practical shorthand, then as something deeper armor begins to carry faint markings. A stripe here, a tally there. Unofficial symbols that hint at identity within the uniformity. Private jokes pass quietly between brothers. A glance across a firing line carries meaning. No instructor can fully measure what followed was a gradual awakening. Within this controlled environment, an understanding that their loyalty is to the squad first and to the Republic, through the squad, that bond would shape every decision they make when the doors of Kamino finally open to real deployment. For now, the storm remains outside the transparasteel, and the war exists only as simulation targets and tactical hollows. Yet somewhere beyond those endless clouds, Geonosis waits. The day is approaching when the hum of machinery will be replaced by the scream of artillery, when carefully scripted scenarios will give way to missions where every choice can end a brother's story. And that transition is closer than any of them realize. Armor as identity, custom gear, colors, and quiet rebellion inside those silent halls on Kamino. The first hint of individuality did not come from voices or names. It came from armor. The Kaminoans had designed a shell for the Republic's most elite soldiers that was as much instrument as protection. This was Katarn-class. Commando armor heavier than the plates worn by standard infantry, sealed against vacuum and toxins. Its servos and reinforced joints turned enhanced muscles into controlled power, and behind the blank visor, an upgraded HUD painted the world in data, threat indicators, squad vitals, targeting solutions all layered over the rain streaked glass. To an outside observer, it was simply better armor to the Commandos. It was the first thing that felt distinct. The suit's integrated systems allowed a single trooper to slice doors plant charges or coordinate artillery without ever lowering a weapon. Environmental sealing meant that frozen tundras, toxic swamps and airless hulls became just more terrain. To cross what followed was a quiet shift in how these clones understood themselves. The armor was not just issued gear, it was a partner in every mission. A constant second skin that would shape the way each squad moved through the galactic war. Over time, small differences began to appear. The regulations on Kamino emphasized uniformity, but the reality of commando work encouraged adaptation attachments. Appeared first specialized ammo packs, extra sensor nodes, custom vibroblades clipped to thighs. Each addition reflected a role within the team. Tech experts weighted their gauntlets with tools. Demolitions specialists carried additional mag strips for charges. Snipers tuned their visors for long-range clarity. The story of these modifications was a story of function slowly becoming identity. Then came color. The standard white and gray of the Republic gave way to careful strokes of paint, tally marks along forearms, squad sigils on pauldrons, personal emblems hidden on the inside of a wrist plate. Delta Squad became instantly recognizable, even beneath the storm and smoke of Battle Boss with his bold orange accents. Fixer marked in green, Scorch in yellow. 7 deep blood red. Each pattern was practical, yet unmistakably personal. In Legends, Omega Squad moved in the opposite direction, their armor darkened almost to black, a subdued presence built for night raids and deniable missions. Their very silhouette told a different story of the same war. These markings were more than decoration. They were small acts of defiance against a life written in genetic code in a galaxy defined by the Force and the pull between dark side and light side. The clones had no destiny beyond service, yet a hand-painted stripe or a scratched-in kill count was something no Kaminoan had programmed and no Jedi general had ordered. It was a claim, however fragile, on being someone rather than something, and for soldiers bred to be interchangeable. That quiet rebellion mattered in the sterile light of Kamino's training chambers. This gear still gleamed unscarred. Every dent was theoretical. Every scorch mark imagined soon that would change the first deployment orders were already moving through encrypted channels. The Commandos' personalized armor would leave the safety of simulators and step into real dust and real fire toward a barren world called Geonosis, where what they found there would change everything and where the color of a single visor might be the last thing a brother ever saw. Thrown into the fire, Commandos at the first battle of Geonosis. Geonosis was where theory ended, and the Clone Wars truly began, a barren world of red rock and bone-white spires, where the air itself seemed to grind with dust and static. The Republic's new army descended through skies streaked with turbo-laser fire, an entire generation of soldiers bred for conflict, stepping into the first real test of their existence. In that storm of sound and sand, the Commandos finally left the safe glow of Kaminoan hollows and walked into a war that would shape the rest of their short lives. On the surface, the battle appeared to be endless ranks of standard clones surging against endless ranks of battle droids. But beneath that chaos, smaller shadows moved with precision. Commando squads were not thrown into mass assaults. Instead, they were threaded through the battle in specialized roles, slipping between artillery impacts to secure landing zones for gunships, moving ahead of walker lines to sabotage droid foundries and power relays, cutting into Geonosian hives to extract downed Jedi before they vanished forever, and quietly mapping enemy positions so that the larger Republic machine could grind forward with purpose rather than blind fury. Among these units, Delta Squad's first real deployment became the story of how simulation met reality under fire. Their insertion into Geonosian territory was fast and brutal, a low drop through anti-air flak into canyons already choked with wreckage of LAAT gunships and shattered droids. They hit the ground into immediate contact. Tight coordination replaced any trace of hesitation. Sev's rifle fire pinned down clusters of Geonosians skittering along the canyon walls. Fixer cut into local comm networks under a rain of dust and shrapnel. Scorch moved from archway to archway, planting charges on support struts, while Boss kept the squad's angles overlapping in a perfect kill box. What followed was a methodical advance that mirrored every drill, yet felt entirely different because this time the bodies did not stand back up. The Commandos used demolitions to collapse access tunnels, stealth to bypass fortified hives, and silent takedowns in the dark to keep their presence hidden. But every few meters, the reality of the battle pressed in burned-out troop carriers strewn with identical white armor, a fallen Jedi still clutching a deactivated lightsaber clone helmets half buried in dust, their visors blackened and empty. For the first time, the squad saw brothers and Jedi lying in numbers that no training scenario had ever dared to show. The psychological impact ran deep beneath their helmets. The transition from simulation to reality was not marked by panic, but by a subtle, internal shift. The understanding that a missed shot or delayed order would not trigger a Kaminoan reset. Instead, a brother would simply be gone over time. That knowledge settled into a quiet, professional resolve. They acknowledged the dead in short, clipped phrases, logged their losses, and moved on because the mission still demanded progress. Scorch still armed his charges. Sev still watched the angles. Fixer still decrypted enemy data. Boss still gave the next waypoint. To the wider galactic holofeeds, Geonosis became the beginning of a grand heroic war, the day the Republic rose with Jedi at its head to confront a separatist menace. But for the Commandos, it marked the opening chapter of something far more narrow and relentless. A long, grinding series of missions executed in the shadows, rarely recorded in official histories, and almost never named as the campaign shifted away from Geonosis. and deeper into the outer rim. Those small squads would be sent again and again into the dark, where their war continued, even when the main battle had already moved on. Delta Squad emerges. Faces, voices, and roles. Within an elite team, in that darkness, one particular squad would emerge again and again, a fixed point amid shifting fronts and forgotten campaigns. The story of the Clone Commandos narrows now to 4 helmets moving as one Delta Squad. Delta's leader, RC, 1138, known simply as Boss, stood at the center of that formation, disciplined, focused, and unshakably calm. Bred and trained to make hard decisions without hesitation, he embodied the Kaminoan ideal of command, a soldier who could read a battlefield in a heartbeat and commit his brothers to risk. Without flinching, his voice carried the clipped certainty of someone who understood that delay meant death over time. His presence became the quiet gravity around which the rest of the squad orbited, the steady tone that cut through blaster fire and panic, and pulled every fragmented moment back into order. Beside him moved RC, 1140. Fixer, the squad's slicer and technician, where Boss projected command. Fixer projected procedure. Methodical, precise, and sometimes rigid, he represented the analytical side of commando work, the part that treated a separatist fortress shield or a locked data core as just another problem to be dismantled. His helmet markings evoked circuitry, and his manner rarely shifted from cool professional focus when others traded comments. Fixer monitored sensors, calculated breach timings, and ensured that the squad's gear never failed in the field. If Fixer was the quiet hum of systems, then RC, 1262 Scorch, was the controlled detonation waiting for the exact second to ignite demolitions. Expert and most openly humorous of the 4, he carried the heaviest charges and the lightest tone. His comments on the comm channel skirted the edge of irreverence, but beneath that levity lay lethal precision with explosives. A misjudged blast could erase an entire squad in an instant, and Scorch knew it. What followed was a career defined by perfectly placed charges, collapsed droid foundries, and silent space stations, suddenly torn open to vacuum at the far edge of the formation. Often visually and emotionally stood RC-1207, Sev, the sniper and hunter. His voice carried an intense, almost predatory calm. His words, few. His focus absolute. Through magnified optics, he watched the war from a distance, measuring breath and wind and the fleeting gap in armor plates that meant an enemy would never fire again. In Sev, the psychological toll of the conflict became visible, a darker edge that hinted at what long-term isolation behind a scope could do, even to a clone bred for battle together. These 4 formed a pattern of professionalism, banter, and unspoken trust that would shape how their missions unfolded. Boss, issuing orders. Fixer, calculating paths. Scorch, punctuating tension with a remark before triggering devastation. Sev, marking targets in the dark. The Republic would deploy them to Geonosis, derelict cruisers, and remote separatist worlds, and what they found there would change everything, because through Delta Squad, the war could be seen not as grand strategy, but as a series of doors, breached corridors, cleared, and choices made between brothers. In the next chapters, their footsteps will lead deeper into those operations where a single quiet order on the comm would decide who survived a mission and who did not. Omega Squad, in the shadows, a darker reflection of the Commando life. In the shadow of Delta Squad's cleanly executed insertions, another unit moved through the war with a different weight on their shoulders. The story of Omega Squad begins not with a proud graduation on Kamino, but with failure, death, and reassignment. These were not brothers, grown and trained together from the first day. Instead, they were survivors, drawn from shattered units, stitched into a new formation, because the Republic could not afford to waste assets on paper. Omega was just another Commando squad. In practice, it was a quiet experiment in how far the program could bend before it broke. 9 of the sergeant carried a burden of command with a relentless steadiness that masked constant doubt. Darman had watched his original squad die on Geonosis and walked off that killing field alone. Atin had been abused by trainers and left with scars that were as much in the mind as in the flesh. Fee hid his own fear behind humor and easy charm. Over time, these fragments learned to move as one. but the cracks never fully disappeared in the Republic. Commando novels, their missions pulled the camera away from the front lines and into the alleys, basements and safe houses of a galactic war that rarely made the holonews Omega was sent into dense urban districts where separatist agents hid among civilians into counter-terrorism operations on worlds that officially were not battlefields, and into interrogations and extractions where the distinction between soldier and assassin blurred. What followed was a slow erosion of certainty, each objective completed, but each victory feeling a little less clean, unlike the sweeping charges. Of open conflict, Omega's work emphasized the quiet power of a single decision made in the dark, a hostage spared or eliminated, a suspected informant released or disappeared. One operation might mean planting evidence to trigger a local coup. Another might involve watching a target's family to predict their movements. The Force did not guide them. There were no Jedi at their shoulders, only orders encrypted on a datapad, and the knowledge that failure would be erased rather than reported within that pressure cooker. The squad became a lens on trauma and doubt in the clone ranks. Niner worried about keeping his damaged brothers functional as much as keeping them alive. Darman's grief and unexpected attachments on the field raised questions about whether clones were meant to have private lives at all. Atin fought against the conditioning that told him pain was weakness, while Fee's injuries forced the entire unit to confront what happened to commandos who could no longer fight. This was where quiet rebellion began, not in open mutiny, but in small hesitations in the moment before a trigger pull. Yet Omega and Delta were not opposites so much as parallel lines. Both squads revealed how the Republic used its finest soldiers as tools for its most secret and morally complicated tasks. One moved in the spotlight of celebrated operations, the other in the half-light of deniable missions. Together, they showed that beneath the armor, the war was rewriting the men who fought it, and in the next chapters, that inner battle between duty and identity will become as important as any firefight. Black Ops and broken droids, covert missions across the outer rim in any galactic war. Real power often hides in the shadows, while grand fleets clash in orbit and Jedi duel Sith in the open. The quiet footsteps of a handful of soldiers decide which worlds burn and which survive. The story of the Clone Commandos in the Outer Rim is the story of those footsteps moving through the dark unseen and unacknowledged throughout the Clone Wars. Their missions fell into a few ruthless patterns: sabotage of the separatist war machine, precision strikes against leadership, deep intelligence gathering, and the extraction of assets too valuable to lose or too dangerous to leave behind. Each category sounded simple in a briefing room on Coruscant, out on the dust-choked moons and silent ship corridors. What followed was something very different. Sabotage came first in many campaigns on worlds where droid foundries glowed through the night. Commandos slipped in ahead of the main assault on Kilura. In Legends, a small team moved through fields of genetically engineered grain and hostile fauna to reach a hidden facility producing advanced nanoscale explosives. Their task was not glorious. They planted charges, mapped production cycles, and vanished before dawn. When the factory erupted, the local separatist hold collapsed without a single Republic cruiser firing a shot. Other nights the target was not metal, but command on worlds such as Fest and Gaftakar Black Ops squads were sent to capture or eliminate separatist generals and corporate magnates whose decisions would shape entire sectors. Sometimes they ghosted through fortified mansions, taking one life and ending a campaign before it began. Sometimes they boarded cruisers in mid-transit, cutting through hull plating to reach a single conference room, then leaving the ship adrift and leaderless in space. Intelligence work demanded even more patience over time. Certain squads became ghosts that lived behind enemy lines for weeks. They tapped holonet relays in abandoned outposts, recorded droid deployment patterns, and traced the flow of credits from shadow banks to front companies on distant worlds. The data they exfiltrated guided Jedi task forces and Republic fleets, turning scattered battles into coordinated pressure on the Separatist alliance. Extraction missions were the most desperate and the most personal rescue of captured officers. Defecting scientists or even compromised Jedi often meant inserting into a losing battle rather than a winning one. On one such operation, a commando unit infiltrated a separatist research vessel in deep space to retrieve a codebreaker whose work could expose entire Republic supply routes. The shipboard assault moved room by room, in zero-G, a slow, silent approach, followed by seconds of blaster fire, and then only drifting bodies and the hiss of leaking atmosphere. Their small numbers and heavy training meant that a four-man squad could alter the fate of systems. Advanced armor dampened their steps and blurred their outlines. Specialized gear let them breach vaults, slice encrypted networks, and survive in environments that would kill standard troops in minutes. Again and again, a single successful operation shifted the balance of a whole campaign. Even if the official records never named the men who made it possible emotionally, their war moved in a relentless rhythm. Hours of tense waiting in cramped hideouts, the soft click of rechecked weapons, the quiet murmur of brothers planning for outcomes that ended in death, then sudden explosions of violence. A doorway kicked in, a thermal detonator, armed 3 shots. 2 voices cut off mid-sentence, and then silence again. Only the hum of distant machinery and the harsh sound of their own breathing. Often, these missions brushed against the edges of more familiar stories. A commando team, softening defenses before a Jedi-led assault on a fortress. A Black Ops insertion that ensured a celebrated victory on Ryloth or Scarco Minor was even possible from the surface. Those battles belonged to heroes in robes and starfighter aces. In the shadows, unseen figures were adjusting the odds. And in the next part of their history, those hidden intersections between Jedi and Commandos will become far more dangerous than anyone expected. Crossing paths with the Jedi, uneasy allies on the same side. From a distance it seemed simple. Jedi led from the front, and clones followed. But in the quiet corridors of Republic Command, the story of the Clone Commandos unfolded along a different chain of authority. Many of these squads did not march in the shadow of a lightsaber. Instead, they answered to Republic intelligence handlers, special operations, commanders, or senior clone officers whose orders arrived through encrypted channels rather than battlefield speeches. Over time, this separation created a different culture for the Commandos. While standard legions grew used to the presence of a general in robes, these small units often deployed with no Jedi on the ground. Their missions were measured in objectives achieved and data exfiltrated, not in inspirational charges or dramatic duels with the dark side. What followed was a hidden parallel war where the Force was rarely mentioned, yet always shaping the galactic currents around them when Commandos did cross paths with Jedi. The encounters carried a quiet weight. There was no awe in the way veterans of Geonosis regarded their generals only a professional recognition. The Jedi saw in these clones a rare blend of independence, discipline, and creativity tools that could operate in the shadows without constant guidance. In turn, the Commandos respected the Jedi as powerful leaders, yet often judged them as distant or even naive about the true cost of each operation. In Legends accounts, this tension became most vivid in the bond between Etan Turmukan and Omega Squad. Their campaigns on Chilura and beyond showed how a young Jedi Knight drawn into the world of special operations struggled to reconcile the light side with the brutal efficiency demanded by commando warfare. She learned their names, their fears, and their humor. And what they found there would change everything. Because once a Jedi saw the Commandos as people, rather than assets, every order carried a different weight for the Commandos. The war narrowed down to corridors, cleared landing zones secured, and brothers brought home alive. The Jedi. The conflict existed on multiple planes at once. A struggle in the Force, a test of the Republic's soul, and a looming echo of ancient Sith designs. This difference in perspective would shape countless decisions. A commando sergeant might accept collateral damage as the cold arithmetic of survival, while a Jedi general hesitated over a single endangered village or captured informant. These frictions were rarely open arguments. More often, they appeared in a glance held too long after a mission debrief or a question about why a target had to die instead of be captured. Sometimes a Jedi's refusal to sacrifice civilians forced commandos into riskier plans. Sometimes a commando's ruthless efficiency shocked a Jedi who still believed the Republic could emerge from the war untainted in those moments. Loyalty to orders collided with loyalty to conscience, yet beneath the differences, there remained a fragile mutual respect. Both sides believed they were protecting the galaxy from a darker future. Neither understood how completely that future had already been written. Soon, the same independence that made commandos invaluable and the same moral doubts that haunted their Jedi allies would be tested by a single command transmitted across the stars. And when Order 66 arrived, those quiet disagreements over duty and mercy would decide who turned their weapons and who refused. Inside the helmet, psychology, individuality, and quiet doubt. In the silence that followed that distant transmission, another silence had already taken root. It lived behind mirrored visors and filtered breaths, the private world inside a Clone Commando's helmet, where orders met doubt and conditioning met the first fragile hints of self from their earliest days on Kamino. Commandos were immersed in danger simulations that normalized loss and sacrifice. High-risk missions were not exceptions, but expectations. Constant exposure to death and failure carved deep channels in their minds to survive they built. Coping mechanisms that standard line infantry rarely had the space to develop. Some turned to dry humor, traded in low voices over encrypted channels. Others relied on ritual. The same pre-mission weapon checked the same quiet mantra. Before breaching a door, a few retreated into emotional detachment, treating every operation as a problem to be solved rather than a life to be risked. Over time, those habits became identities, and inside four-man squads, individuality began to surface in ways that would shape everything that followed. Nicknames replaced numbers, armor bore personal markings, and preferred loadouts became extensions of personality in that cramped circle of trust. Commandos shared private opinions about Jedi generals, about the Republic that owned their DNA, and about a galactic war that never seemed to end. The story of the Commandos was not only one of perfect obedience, but of small, guarded disagreements, spoken only where no officer could hear. A mega squad in Legends made this inner landscape unmistakably clear. Darman's relationship with the Jedi Atine Turmukan showed what happened when a soldier bred for obedience encountered genuine affection. What followed was a quiet rebellion, not against the Republic, but against the idea that he was only property. Her willingness to see him as a person, and his desperate need to believe that this act of mercy would reshape galactic history only in miniature. Within the boundaries of one scarred soldier's heart, Artin's trauma ran in the opposite direction. A history of abuse during training left him suspicious of authority and slow to trust even his own brothers. The Kaminoans had intended pain as a tool to harden him. Instead, it became a lens through which every order was questioned, not aloud, but in the privacy of thought. These were not the doubts of a traitor, but the reflexes of someone who had learned that those in power could be as dangerous as any enemy in the field. Officially, there was no future for commandos beyond war, yet over time, the endless cycle of deployments began to erode the illusion of purpose. Between missions in dim barracks and gunship holds, they wondered in low-coded phrases. What waited for them when the fighting stopped? Was there a place for veterans who had never been children in any normal sense? Or would the empire that replaced the Republic simply discard them as obsolete assets as the conflict deepened and missions grew darker? Those seeds of individuality and doubt pressed steadily against their armor. Soon that private resistance inside the helmet would collide with the most absolute order ever given, and the gap between property and person would be forced into the open, the Citadel and beyond. Commandos at canonical flashpoints on the surface. The Clone Wars appeared to be decided by grand fleets and famous generals, yet beneath that spectacle, smaller shadows moved through the cracks of the conflict. The story of the Clone Commandos at the great flashpoints of the war would shape outcomes that the galactic holonews never recorded around the midpoint of the war. The Republic turned its attention to a nightmare installation, simply called the Citadel. Built on Lola Sayu, it was a fortress designed to break Jedi, a high-security separatist prison carved into volcanic rock and wrapped in energy fields that could snuff out life support. In an instant, the mission sent Anakin Skywalker, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Captain Tarkin into its teeth to rescue Master Even Piel. What followed was a slow attrition through corridors mined with traps, auto turrets, and droid ambushes that chewed through clones. One squad at a time, operations of that scale did not rest on heroism. Alone, they depended on commando-style tactics that rarely reached the briefing room. Hollows, stealth insertion through blind spots in orbital scans, slicing into shield grids and life support controls, demolition charges placed on power relays and turbolift shafts. These were the quiet arts that opened doors. Before Jedi ignited their blades, even when specific units such as Delta Squad did not stand on screen, their training manuals lived in the tactics used to breach the Citadel and to extract survivors under fire. Earlier in the war, Delta Squad had already stepped briefly into the cannon light on Deveron after a devastating separatist assault. The Republic dispatched 4 commandos in white and blue armor through the ruined jungle. Their task was not conquest, but retrieval. They recovered the body of the fallen Jedi Master Halsey and carried him with solemn precision back to the gunship. It was a small scene, yet a quiet confirmation that elite squads moved alongside the better-known heroes, honoring the dead, while the war machine pressed forward. Beyond these named missions, entire campaigns hinted at unseen commando work on Ryloth, while Mace Windu and Cham Syndulla liberated cities from orbital occupation. Other teams likely slipped into droid foundries to sabotage munitions or severe separatist supply routes beneath the sand on Skako Minor, the rescue of Wat Tambor's prisoner, and the march of the Bad Batch through crumbling factories suggested a wider pattern of surgical strikes deep in enemy infrastructure. Over time, these parallel operations became the invisible scaffolding of Republic victories. Then came the pattern that did not fit as the war dragged on. Assignment orders grew. Stranger commandos were diverted from frontline targets to obscure listening posts, encrypted labs and remote temples, where the dark side hummed just below perception, while the galaxy believed the conflict to be a simple struggle for territory and power. These missions hinted at another layer entirely. Soon the same squads that had cracked fortresses and saved Jedi would be sent into operations where the enemy was no longer only droids, but the very meaning of loyalty itself. Gregor on Abafar, a lost commando, and the fragility of identity in the middle of this hidden struggle. One commando simply vanished from the galactic map. Officially, he was listed as missing in action on Sarish, another nameless casualty of a war that consumed entire legions. In reality, the story of Captain CC 557639 did not end in fire and debris. It drifted into dust on the remote world of Abafar, far from the great fleets and Jedi temples. A lone man washed dishes in a dim cantina. The planet itself seemed drained of color, a pale horizon under a washed-out sky. Its silence broken only by distant machinery and muffled conversation. This man answered to the name Gregor. He moved with the weary rhythm of routine, carrying trays, scrubbing plates, accepting orders from a petty proprietor, unaware that he had once carried orders from generals. Yet beneath the stained apron and tired expression, something remained over time. Small traces of training surfaced in quiet ways. A tray caught before it could fall, a route through a crowded room chosen with tactical precision, a distant explosion that made him straighten. Instinctively, as if waiting for coordinates, his mind had been fractured by trauma and amnesia, his memories scattered, but the conditioning of a clone commando lingered in muscle memory and reflex, a silent echo of Kaminoan design and endless drills. When D-Squad arrived on Abafar, what followed was a slow uncoiling of that buried identity. The mismatched group of droids and their tiny commander saw in Gregor what he could not see in himself. They discovered his armor stored away, his designation encoded in Republic files. What they found there would change everything for Gregor. The sight of that battered commando armor was not just a reminder of war, it was a mirror held up to a forgotten self. As the droids explained the larger conflict, the Clone Wars, the Republic, the looming threat of the separatist supertanker, the force that had shaped his entire existence began to pull at him. Again, he trained in the empty streets, relearning how to move, how to fire, how to command his body answered before. His mind could fully remember each drill peeled back another layer until the dishwasher and the soldier stood side by side within him. One had to give way when the separatist facility had to be destroyed. Gregor made his choice. He donned his armor, reclaimed his rank, and fought with the precision of an elite commando, holding off wave after wave of droids so D-Squad could escape in a blaze of fire and dust. He was consumed. Also, the Republic believed his sacrifice ensured their survival, and in that moment his identity crystallized around duty. Once more, Gregor's fate on Abafar reveals something fragile at the core of every commando engineered for war. Their sense of self can be shattered, rewritten, and repurposed by the needs of an empire or a republic. Yet it can never be entirely erased. Even when memory fails, the imprint of brotherhood training and purpose remains. But Gregor's story does not truly end in that burning field on Abafar. Decades later, in the Age of the Rebellion, his return would show that the echoes of the Clone Wars were not finished reshaping history just yet. Between missions, barracks life, gallows humor, and unspoken fears, in the quiet that followed, far from burning fields and lost memories, the Commandos returned to the only constant. They truly knew the spaces between missions. Their barracks were rarely grand. Often they were converted storage rooms on Venator-class star destroyers, or temporary bunks carved into the walls of forward operating bases. Dim lights hummed overhead, casting armor and faces in a muted glow. Weapons lay disassembled on benches in neat, almost ritual lines. The air held the soft murmur of conversations that were not meant for officers or Kaminoans, only for brothers. In these staging bays, the story of the Commandos unfolded in whispers and small movements, not in explosions here. Power did not come from detonators or orbital strikes, but from the simple act of sitting shoulder to shoulder. A clone bent over a DC-17M, cleaning carbon scoring from the barrel. Another traced a familiar pattern in the paint on a helmet, checking for new cracks. Some squads shared cramped mess tables, pushing ration trays together to imitate a real meal. Others lounged against crates, staring at the deck plating until their thoughts drifted somewhere beyond the next objective. Gallows humor lived in these shadows. It was a shield against the dark, and clones such as Scorch wielded it with precision after a mission that went wrong. He might tap a fresh scorch mark on his armor and remark that the enemy had terrible aim. They had missed all the important bits. The laughter that followed was rarely loud, but it was real quiet chuckles, a few muttered comebacks, a shake of the head. This banter served as a pressure valve in a war where the margin between success and annihilation narrowed with every deployment. What followed was a strange balance between dread and relief, stitched together by teasing insults and shared memories that only Commandos understood. Yet beneath the jokes, unspoken fears pooled in the corners of those rooms. Fear of losing a squad mate in the next breach. Fear of being the one who made the wrong call at the wrong second. Fear that an injury would not bring rest. Only reassignment to some faceless Imperial program or quiet decommissioning questions about orders, about the grand strategy of the Republic, rarely reached the surface. The Kaminoan conditioning ran deep, but over time small hesitations appeared in the pauses between words. A glance held a little too long. A story cut short when an officer passed by. Human details anchored them against that rising tide of anxiety. Some Commandos invented games with spent power packs and ration tins gambling for nothing more than bragging rights. Others collected tiny trophies, a strip of separatist droid plating, a shell casing from Geonosis. There were nights in open hangar bays when a commando would sit on a crate, helmet off, eyes lifted to the stars, beyond the magnetic field, wondering without saying it if there was any path for a clone beyond the war itself. As campaigns dragged on and the galactic conflict deepened, these in-between spaces grew heavier. Armor took longer to remove, conversations shortened into nods and half-finished sentences. The weight of accumulated missions, lost brothers, and rumors of shifting Republic policies settled over the barracks like an extra layer of durasteel. What they found there would change everything. Not through a single revelation, but through a slow, quiet erosion of certainty. When the end finally came, it would arrive not as a gentle release, but as a sudden command that shattered the fragile refuge of those dimly lit rooms and turned every shared memory into a question of survival. Shadows of the future, early signs of the Empire in Commando missions. In the final years of the Clone Wars, the line between open battlefront and quiet repression began to blur for the Commandos. Their missions had once been framed as precise strikes against clear enemy assets. Droid foundries, listening posts, separatist command nodes, but war grinds down certainties over time. And what followed was a subtle redirection of their purpose as Republic resources thinned and public fatigue grew. The High Command and its shadowy advisors turned increasingly to units that could solve problems without headlines. The story of the Clone Commandos shifted from demolishing fortresses to silencing doubts on worlds that were officially loyal. They were dispatched to break up gatherings, labeled as separatist sympathizers, to seize shipments of fuel and kyber that never appeared on public ledgers, to make sure a planetary governor signed the right treaty under the watchful gaze of matte white helmets. The targets were no longer only battle droids, they were opinions and leverage. With this change came a new opacity. In their orders, briefings grew shorter and colder. Objectives were presented as coordinates and code phrases rather than causes. Questions about context met with the same answer. Mission critical, need to know. The commandos had been trained to trust the chain of command, but the chain was now wrapped in shadows. Intelligence units born from the Republic's fear of defeat began to resemble the instruments of an empire that did not yet have a name. Results mattered more than reasons, and the quiet implication was clear. Success would shape futures that clones were never meant to see. Legends, sources whisper of black operations where Delta Squad or unnamed sister units were inserted onto neutral worlds, not to repel a droid army, but to discredit a senator through manufactured evidence, or to provoke a small-scale conflict that justified Republic intervention. In canon, glimpses of this evolution appear in missions on places such as Scarco Minor and the Citadel operations, driven less by open strategy and more by whispered intelligence priorities. The Commando program became a scalpel for sea. Decisions made far from the battlefield, in rooms filled with blue, hollow projected figures and carefully chosen words, for soldiers bred on Kamino with a clear enemy and a simple promise. This shift carried a quiet weight. Some commandos noticed how their armor drew fear in civilians who had never seen a battle droid. How a presence meant to reassure now felt closer to intimidation. What happens to a perfect soldier when the mission stops feeling clean? There were no open mutinies, no grand refusals, only small hesitations, glances exchanged in dropships, the way a hand lingered on a shoulder after an order that cut too close to home. Yet beneath every doubt lay a deeper foundation in their very cells. Somewhere, in the carefully written helixes of their genetic code, a dormant instruction waited. Patient, silent, absolute. When it came, it would not simply redirect a single mission. It would reframe every operation they had ever undertaken, every civilian they had ever guarded, every Jedi they had ever followed. And in an instant, the defenders of the Republic would discover they had been training all along for a different kind of empire, the chip and the choice. That wasn't Commandos and Order 66. In the end, the greatest weapon of the clone army was not armor or blasters. It was a single buried command waiting to be spoken. Order 66 was the quiet answer to questions the Kaminoans had been asked from the beginning. How do you ensure that an army of independent minds never turns on its masters? The solution was the inhibitor chip, a sliver of bioengineered tissue threaded into every clone's brain, designed to override doubt and enforce obedience. When certain codes were given from the outside, this looked no different in a commando than in a standard trooper. The same scar behind the ear, the same medical records, the same assurances of loyalty. Yet beneath that sameness lived a real uncertainty for the Republic's Black Ops units. Their entire program had been built on controlled. Deviation commandos were trained to question, to adapt, to interpret intent rather than follow orders. Blindly, the story of the chips in their skulls is therefore a story of tension between design and doctrine. Canon and legend sources hint at this tension without fully resolving it. Some accounts suggest that the chips worked with brutal clarity, regardless of rank or specialization. When the order came, even elite squads, such as Delta, received the transmission and moved with chilling efficiency from guardians to executioners. Others imply a more complicated moment. Commandos pausing mid-mission, feeling a spike of pain or confusion as the chip seized control. A flicker of resistance drowned beneath a tidal command to eliminate the Jedi. Imagine a squad that had survived Geonosis, the Citadel, and Ryloth, fighting alongside the same general for years. In that instant, the Force-sensitive ally, who had shared rations and trenches, became an enemy target, not through hatred, but through imposed certainty. What followed was a series of actions carried out with the same professionalism that had once saved entire worlds. The same steady hands that had disabled droid factories now raised rifles in temple halls and jungle clearings across the galactic rim. Over time, the cruelty of this design becomes clearer. These soldiers had been bred for loyalty, for brotherhood, for a sense of purpose, rooted in protecting the Republic, and the Jedi who led it Order 66 twisted that purpose without granting them even the small mercy of awareness. There was no conscious choice, no internal debate, just the afterimage of a completed objective and the unshakable conviction that the mission had been necessary. Their memories held no treason, only another successful operation. Yet the fall of the Jedi was not the end of their usefulness to the newborn Empire. For some Commandos, survival meant reassignment. Their talents in infiltration, sabotage, and silent elimination were far too valuable to discard for the next 1,000 years. The Empire would be remembered for stormtrooper legions, but in its earliest days, it also relied on familiar helmets, painted in new colors, hunting different enemies. The question was not whether these survivors would serve the new regime. It was what they found that would change everything. From Republic's blade to Emperor's fist, birth of the Imperial Commandos, what they found there would change everything, because the halls and briefing rooms were the same. But the banners had changed overnight. The Grand Army of the Republic had become the military of a galactic empire, and the commandos who walked those corridors now served a ruler who no longer pretended to be anything else. In the first months after the declaration of the Empire, many commando units were simply refiled in the records. Their designations remained, their armor remained, their weapons remained, but their insignia shifted from the crest of the Republic to the cog of the new regime. What followed was a quiet, administrative transformation that hid a far deeper change. They were no longer the hidden blade of a democracy at war. They were the fist of an empire built on fear. Their mission profiles reflected that shift almost immediately. Instead of infiltrating separatist foundries or rescuing captured Jedi generals, Imperial Commandos were tasked with hunting, surviving Jedi, enforcing Order 66. Long after the initial massacre on worlds that had once cheered for the light side, they now carried out targeted eliminations against former allies. A temple that had been a sanctuary became a kill zone. A governor who had once coordinated with the Republic became a target for removal on remote outer rim worlds. Small squads were deployed to suppress early rebel cells. Sometimes these were organized resistance movements armed and prepared. More often, they were frightened militias or local security forces, reluctant to surrender autonomy to distant Imperial rule. In those operations, the story of the Commandos changed from secret defense to open terror. They were sent to make examples, to burn out the idea of defiance before it could spread. Psychologically, the transition did not look the same from every helmet. For some clones, nothing seemed to change. There was a chain of command. There were orders. There were enemies to neutralize. The Jedi had been branded traitors, and the Empire promised order after years of galactic conflict for others. The absence of familiar Jedi commanders and the new categories of enemy created a quiet dislocation. The same brothers who had once shielded civilians during artillery strikes were now ordered to intimidate those civilians into obedience. Over time, the squads themselves began to change. At first, the new officers were clone veterans promoted into Imperial ranks, but gradually, non-clone specialists and human officers appeared in Commando command structures. They brought different accents, different priorities, and a subtle message the Empire did not intend to rely on Kaminoan creations forever. Training programs were adjusted to integrate conscripted or recruited operatives alongside the aging clones. Their unique skills would shape the doctrine, but not necessarily the future. Then a smaller detail interrupted the pattern and revealed the truth armor, once customized with unit markings and personal symbols, was standardized and repainted in stark Imperial palettes. Individuality was quietly scrubbed away, even as these units were used more openly than ever before. No longer rumors whispered among separatist commanders. Imperial propaganda hinted at shadow units that would appear without warning, erase resistance, and vanish again in the years that followed. Specific operations would etch their presence into local memory. A vanished monastery here, a pacified mining colony there. Each mission a reminder that the Empire's most elite soldiers still moved in the dark. Only now their purpose was not to protect a fragile republic, but to ensure that no new light could threaten the Emperor's rule. Hunting ghosts, Jedi purges, and early rebel suppression. In the shadow of that new purpose, another, quieter campaign began while the Empire's fleets enforced its rule in open space. Smaller transports slipped into hyperspace on missions that were never logged in public records. These were the Jedi purges, carried out not by roaring legions, but by small commando squads moving through the dark. In the months after Order 66, the story of the Commandos shifted from battlefields to backwater worlds. They arrived on forgotten moons, derelict stations, and dust-choked outer rim towns following fragments of intelligence and half-whispered rumors of wandering Jedi masters. Their experience with covert operations made them ideal for this work. They knew how to move unseen, how to wait, how to turn a quiet settlement inside out without leaving a trace around this time. Imperial intelligence began feeding them lists of targets not only confirmed, survivors of the Jedi Order, but healers, teachers and pilgrims whose only crime was being close to the light side. A monastery that once sheltered refugees might now hide a contemplative knight. A mining camp on the edge of known space might harbor a former Padawan trying to disappear. What followed was a methodical pattern of search, encirclement, and sudden violence, often over in minutes. Their training on Kamino had always emphasized infiltration and information gathering under the Republic. This meant slipping into separatist strongholds on Scarco Minor, or tracking smugglers through Ryloth. Now the same skills were turned inward. They studied supply records, intercepted local transmissions, and watched for small anomalies. A shipment of medical supplies beyond a village's means a ship refueled under a false name. A child who reacted strangely when a trooper entered the room in a galaxy ruled by fear. Even a hint of the Force could draw a squad to the door before dawn. There was an emotional dissonance beneath the armor. Many of these clones had once fought shoulder to shoulder with Jedi generals. They had seen them bleed, falter, and stand again under impossible odds. Yet now the same men moved through ruined temples, stepping over scorched robes and extinguished blades. Often they did not fully understand why their allies had become enemies. The inhibitor chips and the habits of a lifetime of obedience left little space for questions. Orders came. Missions were assigned, and squads executed them with the same precision that had once defended the Republic over time-scattered accounts in legends. And fan speculation imagined rare cracks in this machinery. A commando who hesitated at the threshold of a hidden shrine. A sergeant who reported a target dead when the trail could have been followed. A helmet turned away for a single crucial second. Such moments, if they occurred, would have been extremely dangerous. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history only in the future of the Clone Commandos did not. The future of the Clone Commandos did not run along a single path. Some, pressed into deeper Imperial service, became permanent instruments of suppression, hunting early rebel organizers before their movements could become true threats. Others simply disappeared into the margins. Among the most well-known were Gregor, Rex, and Wolf, whose journeys carried them away from Imperial ranks and into quieter, scattered lives. Their survival would shape the next era, hinting that the story of the Commandos was not finished, only hidden, waiting in the edges of galactic history. The Bad Batch and the edge of the program. Experimental clones as cousins to Commandos. Their survival would shape the next era, hinting that the story of the Commandos was not finished, only hidden, waiting in the edges of galactic history, in that quiet space between Republic and Empire. Another experiment stood waiting on Kamino. One that mirrored the Commandos, yet pushed their design philosophy to its limit. Powerful soldiers had always been the goal of the cloning program. But what happens when that power is concentrated into a handful of deliberately flawed specimens? The answer is Clone Force 99, the Bad Batch Hunter Wrecker Tech. Crosshair, and later, Echo were genetically altered clones, each carrying an extreme mutation, heightened senses, brute strength, accelerated intellect, unerring marksmanship. They moved not as a battalion, but as a scalpel, a small squad built on the same principle that had once defined the Commandos from their first appearance on Anaxes. Their methods announced that connection. Hunter reading electromagnetic currents through the force-rich battlefield wrecker, carrying heavy ordnance as if it were nothing. Tech dissecting data in seconds. Crosshair turning distant shots into guarantees. Everything about them echoed the ethos of the old Black Ops units, high-risk, deep insertion missions solved by brothers who trusted one another more than any command chain. What followed was a demonstration that the Republic had not abandoned the Commando idea. It had simply twisted it over time. The Bad Batch drifted even further into that Commando shadow. Their armor heavily customized, scarred, painted and layered with gear. Their tactics, improvisational bordering on reckless, yet effective. They chose their own routes, altered objectives in the field, and ignored regulations when those regulations endangered their brothers on paper. They were a separate experiment, an anomaly, outside standard training pipelines in practice. They stood spiritually beside Delta Squad and Gregor, another proof that the Kaminoans understood the value of small elite teams in a galactic war defined by numbers. When the Empire rose, their story revealed the cost of that independence, where standard units slipped into new codes and new insignia. Clone Force 99 encountered a darker question. What did loyalty mean when the light side ideals of the Republic had been replaced by an empire built on control? Crosshair submitted to programming and doctrine. Hunter and the others resisted missions, shifted from defending worlds to hunting dissidents and former allies. Each operation carried moral weight that standard infantry rarely had the freedom to feel. At the center of that transformation stood Echo, once a regular clone, then an ARC trooper, then a cybernetically altered survivor of Skako Minor. His presence inside the Bad Batch turned the unit into a living bridge between line infantry, ARC training, and Commando-style operations. Echo brought textbook tactics, discipline, and memory of how the war had begun. Hunter's squad brought unorthodox execution together. They showed that elite clone doctrine was not a single path, but a spectrum of adaptation, born from the same need to survive impossible assignments. Yet Clone Force 99 remained an edge case, a visible outlier that made the quieter fate of many commandos easier to understand. Their struggle to find purpose beyond orders mirrored the journey of countless elite clones scattered after Order 66. Some became Imperial enforcers, others deserters, a few protectors in the shadows. And as the Bad Batch carved its uncertain path, it pointed back toward those earlier squads, suggesting that the Commando's legacy did not end. It simply fractured, waiting for the next mission in a galaxy that no longer needed them. Phase out and obsolescence, the slow disappearance of clone commandos. In the quiet that followed those fractured legacies, the Empire made its own decision about the future of the clones' power had shifted, and with it the philosophy of war. The Republic had needed an army that appeared clean, efficient, almost merciful. In its precision, the new Empire wanted something different. It wanted a force that could be disavowed, blamed or replaced without a second thought from the earliest. In days of Imperial rule, the numbers told a story. Kaminoan cloning was expensive, centralized and difficult to fully control. The Stormtrooper program offered an alternative: endless human recruits drawn from across the galactic rim, loyal to pay rank and propaganda, rather than to distant brothers, grown in vats over time. Imperial strategists saw clones as a relic of Jedi influence, a reminder of a war the Emperor wished to redefine and erase for the rank and file. This meant accelerated replacement for the Commandos. It was more complicated. These elite units had been engineered for missions no ordinary soldier could survive. The Empire was not prepared to throw away that level of training overnight. Instead, many surviving commandos were quietly folded into new formations, the earliest Imperial commandos and Special Forces cadres, whose task was to hunt insurgents' former Jedi assets, and anyone who remembered the light side too clearly. Others found their skills redirected toward instruction on worlds and stations far from the core-graying veterans drilled fresh human recruits in close-quarters combat demolitions and infiltration. They became ghosts behind the gleaming white armor, shaping a new generation that would never know Kamino or the brotherhood of the squads. What followed was a slow erasure of identity armor, repainted designations, changed accents and mannerisms beaten down, until the line between clone and recruit blurred in the eyes of the Empire. Not all were kept so carefully. Some commandos were reassigned to missions with vanishing odds of return, sent into dark war zones on the fringes, where failure could be written off as enemy action. Others were simply decommissioned. Their growth, accelerated bodies, deemed too unstable, too costly to maintain medical reports, recorded rapid aging joint failure and cognitive decline. A living reminder that the miracle soldiers of the Clone Wars had been built with an expiration date for the men themselves. This transition was a quiet catastrophe. Soldiers bred for a single conflict watched that war end almost overnight, then listened as officials explained that their purpose had been fulfilled and their model was obsolete. What does a weapon do when the hand that forged it turns away? The answer for many clones was exile, drifting to remote worlds, taking menial work, or vanishing into criminal networks. Their once elite status reduced to a fading memory, traded in cantinas as half-believed war stories. Yet the story of the Commandos did not end entirely in abandonment. Scattered accounts in both canon and legends speak of isolated veterans who found new paths. Gregor resurfacing years later in the Age of Rebellion, fighting alongside dissidents against the very empire that had discarded him, hinted at a broader pattern. A handful of commandos carried their training into a different kind of conflict, and as Rebellion quietly gathered strength in the shadows, those forgotten specialists were about to discover that the galaxy still had missions only they could complete. Gregor returns. From lost soldier to rebel ally, in the quiet years of the early rebellion, power had shifted again. The Clone Wars were over, the Jedi were gone, and the Empire stood unchallenged on 1,000 worlds, yet on a forgotten desert graveyard called Selos. 3 old soldiers waited the story of Gregor's return. Begins there, among the bones of decommissioned walkers and the ghosts of a war. The galaxy tried to forget. By the time the starship Ghost arrived on Selos, Gregor was no longer the precise commando last seen on Abafar. He was older, his hair gone white, his armor battered and mismatched, his behavior seemingly erratic. But beneath the laughter and sudden outbursts, the training remained his stance, his grip on a blaster, the way his eyes measured distance and cover, all marked him as a clone commando who had survived too much to ever fully stand down over time. That eccentricity became a kind of armor of its own, a shield against memories that ran from Kamino's reign to the dust of Abafar at first contact with the rebel crew. He fought alongside Rex and Wolf with the same ruthless efficiency that had once shattered droid lines on Geonosis. When Imperial walkers bore down on their makeshift camp, he moved with instinctive coordination, directing fire, exploiting weak points in armor, turning a hopeless skirmish into an organized defense. What followed was a brief reminder that even scattered and aging, the Republic's elite was still dangerous to any empire that underestimated them. As the rebellion grew, Gregor did not retire back into isolation. Instead, he stepped into a new war, one that mirrored the old in form, but not in purpose, on missions with the Ghost crew. He brought specialist tactics honed in Black Ops operations during the Clone Wars infiltration, demolitions, close quarters, fighting skills that would shape the fate of small engagements across the Outer Rim. There was a quiet irony in watching a former Republic commando defend civilians from stormtroopers who wore armor modeled on his own generation. That irony deepened on Lothal during the campaign to liberate the planet from Imperial control. A world once crushed under TIE factories, and occupation became the stage for Gregor's final stand in the tunnels and streets beneath the Imperial complex. He fought beside rebels, Jedi, and former clones against walkers, troopers, and officers of the very regime his creation had enabled. The circle that began in Kamino and laboratories and on the killing fields of Geonosis closed in the firelight of Lothal's uprising. During the last push, Gregor was mortally wounded in close combat. A blaster shot, finding the gaps that even commando armor could not cover, carried from the battlefield by his brothers. He did not die in confusion or under a control chip. He died clear-eyed content, certain that at last their fight served something beyond Sith plots and political manipulation. In his final words, he framed their lives not as wasted assets of a dead republic, but as soldiers who had finally chosen their own cause. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history, not through grand prophecy, but through the simple fact that clones could still decide. In Gregor's fate lay a pattern for the surviving Commandos. Their lives did not end with decommissioning or quiet disappearance. Some found new meaning in the rebellion, in protecting worlds the Empire treated as resources rather than homes. And as the galactic conflict shifted from open war to scattered uprisings, other veterans of the program were about to step from the shadows, carrying the same scars and the same impossible training into a new era of resistance. Legends of Omega, love, loss, and the dream of desertion. As the Empire tightened its grip and scattered surviving Commandos into new roles, another strand of their history unfolded far from the official record. This was the story of Omega Squad in the Legends continuity, a tale that shifted from pure military efficiency into something far more fragile and forbidden. Over time, their missions became less about targets and more about the bonds that held them together. In the late stages of the Clone Wars, Omega Squad operated in the shadows of the galactic conflict. Their deployments in the Republic Commando novels placed them on worlds where the neat lines between Republic and Separatist blurred. They hunted terrorists, rescued hostages, and dismantled criminal networks. But what followed was a slow awakening to the political machinery. Behind the war, they saw corrupt senators, profiteering Kaminoan geneticists, treating them as assets, and a Jedi Council struggling to sense the dark side rising around them. Within this pressure cooker, the squad's relationships deepened. Niner fought to keep his men functioning, despite mounting injuries and exhaustion. Fee's near-fatal trauma on Coruscant left him brain-damaged for a time, forcing the others to confront the reality that even elite soldiers could simply break Cal Skirata. The Mandalorian sergeant who had trained many Commandos became a father figure moving in the shadows to shield his boys from a republic that saw them as expendable property. His presence would shape every difficult choice that followed. At the center of this emotional web stood Darman and Etan Tuamukan, a clone commando and a Jedi general whose connection defied regulations. Their relationship formed quietly during joint operations, then deepened as both confronted the cost of endless war. When Etan became pregnant with Darman's child, the existence of that child became a living contradiction in galactic law. A clone bred for obedience had created a family. He was never meant to have the birth of their son. Venku was a symbol of a future beyond soldiering, a future rooted not in the Republic's chain of command, but in Mandalorian homesteads and quiet fields for Omega Squad. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history only in the smallest, most personal sense. It proved that clones could be more than serial numbers. They could be fathers, and that realization made every subsequent deployment feel heavier as the war dragged on. Desertion shifted from an unthinkable betrayal to a whispered possibility. Skirata quietly assembled plans to extract his boys from service, offering them false identities and a path to Mandalorian life. Some Commandos accepted the idea. Others hesitated, torn between loyalty to their brothers still in armor and the promise of autonomy and family. Omega's debates around desertion revealed a stark truth. Perfect soldiers were now making imperfect, deeply human choices. Through these Legends narratives, the Commandos stepped beyond their role as weapons. They became people who loved, grieved, and argued about morality in the shadow of the Jedi and the Sith. And while these stories are not canon, they offer a rich lens on what might have been felt beneath the armor, a foundation for understanding how any clone Commando might look at the Empire's new orders and quietly dream of walking away. Tactics and tools. How 4 Commandos could break a planet in the quiet calculus of galactic war. True power rarely announced itself with legions and banners. Sometimes it arrived as 4 helmets in the dark, moving in perfect silence. The story of the Clone Commandos at their most effective was not about heroics on open fields, but about how a single squad could unmake the defenses of an entire world and leave almost no trace behind on paper. A standard Commando squad seemed simple. 1 leader, 1 tech specialist, 1 demolitions expert, and 1 marksman. Yet the Kaminoans understood that war was chaos over time. Every Commando was cross-trained in every field. The sergeant might slice a security grid, the sniper might lay charges, The tech might make the hard call to take command if the leader fell. This redundancy meant that no single loss could break the unit, and what followed was a doctrine built on adaptability rather than rigid hierarchy. Their missions usually unfolded in 4 distinct phases. First came reconnaissance, patient observation from concealment mapping, patrol routes, sensor coverage and enemy reactions to small disturbances, then infiltration using stealth field generators, climbing gear, and the shadows between cameras. They slipped through gaps the defenders did not know existed. Objective execution came next: sabotage, capture, or elimination, each demanding a different mindset from surgical restraint to controlled devastation. Finally, exfiltration, the most dangerous phase, when alarms were rising and escape corridors were collapsing behind them. Their tools reflected this flexible brutality. The DC 17-meter modular blaster rifle formed the core of their arsenal, one weapon that could shift between assault rifle sniper configuration and anti-armor launcher. Without breaking stride, specialized explosives sat beside it, shaped charges, breaching detonators, and remote mines tuned to crack. Durasteel doors or topple shield pylons without leveling entire city blocks, slicing gear, compact data pads, and spike modules. Let the tech specialists turn enemy networks into open books. Sensor beacons and micro-droids extended their awareness beyond the range of sight, while armor-integrated communications and HUD systems stitched the 4 minds together into a single, calm, relentless intent. Consider a fortified world whose planetary shield made orbital assault impossible. The objective: disable a buried generator complex. Without triggering a full-scale response, the squad would insert far from the primary target. Perhaps on a dead plateau, under cover of a meteor shower, the marksman would scout ahead, tagging patrols through the HUD, while the leader plotted a path through maintenance tunnels, identified on stolen schematics. What they found there would change everything. Forgotten exhaust shafts, unsecured service doors, and complacent guards who had never truly been tested deep within the complex. The tech specialist would slice into local systems, looping cameras and feeding false power readings to the control room. The demolitions expert would place charges not on the main reactor, but on coolant lines and shield relays, creating a cascading failure that appeared at first to be an accident. When the detonations came, the shield would falter just long enough for a distant fleet to strike. And by the time defenders understood that an attack had occurred, the Commandos would already be exfiltrating through an alternate route, masked by the chaos they had engineered for thousands of years. Generals and Sith Lords alike had dreamed of weapons that could change campaigns with a single blow clone. Commandos were the Republic's quiet answer, small units designed as force multipliers capable of altering the course of entire operations without medals, parades, or even acknowledgement outside their chain of command. And as the war deepened, these same tactics would shape not only earthy battlefields, but the hidden moral choices each squad carried into the dark side of the Empire's birth. Worlds in the dark, Geonosis, Ryloth, Skako Minor, and other silent battlefields. As the war deepened, the battlefields themselves became characters in the story of the Commandos, harsh, silent witnesses to operations that would never appear in official records. Power in this era was not only measured in fleets and Senate votes, but in who could move unseen through the dark places of the galaxy. And return on Geonosis, the surface battles drew the cameras and the history text, yet beneath the dust storms, another war unfolded in the tunnels. The Geonosians had carved for thousands of years. Narrow passages choked with machinery, and chittering workers became perfect hunting grounds for small squads. The factories pulsed with the thrum of droid assembly lines. Shadows thrown by molten metal and welding sparks offered cover for approach and escape. A single charge placed on a load-bearing column could silence an entire wing of production. What followed was a campaign of sabotage that never had a name. Only coordinates and casualty estimates, deeper still. In those hives, the air grew hot and thin. Lights flickered against resin-coated walls, and the force felt heavy with fear. Here, Commandos moved in stacked formations, helmets brushing the ceiling armor, scraping stone. Every sound mattered. A dropped casing, a misstep on loose gravel could bring a swarm of drones in seconds. Expectation would suggest chaos. Yet the reality was slow, methodical progress, punctuated by sudden bursts of violence and then silence again. Far from Geonosis, on Ryloth, the war took on a different texture. The planet's occupied cities were half-starved and half-fortress streets patrolled by droids and separatist armor, while Twi'lek resistance cells vanished into the labyrinth of alleys and underpasses. Commandos slipped through those same streets at night, moving from shattered rooftop to shattered rooftop, guiding artillery fire with quiet precision or cutting power to occupation grids so local fighters could strike in the dark side of the blackout. Beyond the cities, the mesas and canyonlands turned operations into a vertical puzzle. Sheer drops, dust-laden winds, and narrow passes forced squads to think in 3 dimensions, a rappel line here, a hidden sensor. There a sniper nest carved into the rock overlooking a separatist convoy route on Skako Minor. The environment itself became the first enemy industrial complexes, hung over toxic chasms held aloft by skeletal frameworks that groaned in the wind. The air was thick with chemical haze and static discharge. Specialized gear and training were not luxuries, but prerequisites. Sealed armor filters, recalibrated optics, and reinforced boots allowed commandos to move where standard infantry would simply fail. What they found, they would change everything for some units, not in terms of politics, but in understanding how far the galactic war had pushed. Industry toward dehumanization, rows of droids assembled without pause, living workers reduced to monitored silhouettes behind thick glass. Beyond these famous theaters, countless outer rim worlds absorbed operations that vanished into obscurity. Dusty settlements on forgotten moons, swamp-choked lowlands, where every step threatened to swallow armor, whole frozen outposts where the only sound was wind against durasteel. Over time, such missions blurred into one another, unnamed raids, extractions, and rescues that altered local fates while remaining invisible to grand strategy. Yet each left an imprint on the men who survived them in the quiet between deployments. Commandos carried those landscapes in memory, the echo of Geonosian tunnels, the thin air above Ryloth's canyons, the metallic taste of Skako Minor's storms, and somewhere ahead awaited a world not yet marked on their charts, a place where orders would come down that no training could truly prepare them to follow. Command structure. In the shadows. Who gave the commandos their orders? The orders that sent those squads from one haunted landscape to the next did not always come from the bridge of a Venator or the calm voice of a Jedi general. In many cases, the commandos moved in the shadows of a different hierarchy, a web of handlers, analysts, and covert directors that sat between the Grand Army and the quiet bureaucrats of Republic intelligence on paper. Most clones answered to Jedi commanders and to clone officers such as Cody Bly and their equivalents across the galactic war effort. That structure mirrored the old Republic's faith in the Jedi as guardians of the light side. But the story of the commandos followed a different path when missions involved destabilizing a government, sabotaging a hyperlane, or eliminating a single unseen target. The chain of command narrowed to special operations branches and intelligence cells that answered not to the front lines, but to secure briefing rooms on Coruscant. In this hidden world, figures emerged who were never part of the official Holonet reports. Among them in Legends stood Cal Skirata, a grizzled Mandalorian mercenary. Turned instructor, Skirata did more than teach close-quarters combat. He became a father figure and handler for many of the Null ARCs and Commandos. What followed was an unusual bond in a war defined by distance. Skirata cursed Kaminoans in private, fought for better pay and medical care, and threatened officers who treated his boys as expendable assets. His presence would shape how those soldiers understood loyalty not just to the Republic, but to each other. Orders for these units rarely arrived on an open channel. Instead, they came as encrypted packets delivered in windowless rooms or aboard dimly lit gunships. Mission parameters were compartmentalized. The squad might know the target, the insertion point, and the exfiltration route, but not the political struggle behind the objective. Even their handlers only saw fragments of the larger design. In some operations, a Jedi liaison offered guidance through the Force. In others, there was no Jedi at all, only a cold briefing and a countdown over time. That structure carved a quiet isolation into the hearts of the commandos. They were trusted with the most sensitive tasks, yet denied the truth about why those tasks mattered. How does a soldier weigh right and wrong when the reasons for killing are always redacted? The answer for many commandos was simple. They trusted their squad, their sergeant, and in legends men like Scarata, far more than distant senators or unseen strategists. Then came a subtle pattern interrupt in their lives. The war ended, yet the secrecy did not, as the Republic shifted into the Empire. The same channels that once carried classified orders now served a darker purpose. Compartmentalization became a tool not just for protecting information, but for controlling increasingly disillusioned veterans. The commandos who stayed in service found that nothing essential had changed. Missions still arrived in encrypted bursts. Faces of targets still appeared without context. Only now the crest on the orders had changed, and in the shadow of that new symbol, the next command would demand more than they had ever been told to give. Brothers and burdens. How commandos saw themselves. Among other clones in that new darkness, another tension slowly came into focus. The question of what it meant to be an elite among those who were all bred for war on paper. Every clone was a brother, equal in origin and purpose. But in the field, a quiet divide emerged between the commandos and the legions they were meant to protect. The story of that divide would shape how their entire generation remembered itself from the first deployments on Geonosis. Regular troopers watched the commandos move through the dust and fire with a different kind of precision. Heavier armor sealed against the environment-integrated HUDs, and specialized weaponry all marked them as something apart. There was admiration in the way line soldiers tracked their movements through the smoke. Commandos were proof that clone potential could be pushed even further. Yet there was distance as well. Commandos vanished into black ops. Dropships disappeared behind blast doors and returned from missions no one else was cleared to hear about. Over time, this created the sense that they lived in another war, entirely parallel but unreachable inside those armored shells. The reality was more complicated. Commandos carried pride in their training and in the trust placed in four-man teams to turn battles for entire armies, but that pride sat alongside a constant burden. Every insertion carried the knowledge that if they succeeded, thousands of brothers might live, and if they failed, entire brigades could be left exposed. This was not the abstract power of a distant Sith empire. It was the immediate weight of knowing exactly whose helmets would be stacked in the aftermath. Moments when the two worlds met exposed that weight most clearly in Legends campaigns, such as those chronicled around Delta and Omega squads. Commandos were occasionally attached to standard units to break sieges or extract key assets. They bivouacked beside exhausted line troopers, traded ration bars and quiet stories, and then walked into the worst fire the enemy could offer. What followed was often brutal clarity. Commandos saw firsthand the casualty lists that ordinary battalions endured in a single rotation, something their own tight-knit squads were rarely forced to face. At that scale, out of those missions grew a particular kind of survivor's guilt when a four-man team emerged from a shattered citadel and learned that 3 companies had been lost to hold the landing zone. The math was inescapable. 4 lives preserved, hundreds gone. The Force did not offer them any comforting vision of balance, only the knowledge that their survival had been purchased at a terrible price. Some commandos responded by doubling down on their efficiency, others by quietly personalizing armor plates with unit markings of dead regiments, carrying those symbols as moving memorials over time. This mixture of respect, distance, and unspoken grief turned commandos into something more than specialists. In the eyes of many clones, they became custodians of memory, witnesses who had seen both the hidden missions and the open slaughter as the galactic conflict edged toward its end. That sense of brotherhood and burden would follow them into the new empire, ensuring that in the long shadow of history, they would be remembered not only as weapons, but as caretakers of their own kind's legacy. Aging out of war, the physical and emotional toll on surviving commandos. As the new empire settled into its cold machinery of control, the clones who had survived its birth discovered that survival carried its own quiet cost, engineered for accelerated growth. Their bodies moved through time at double speed, a commando barely in his second decade. By standard years could carry the bones and breath of a man in his 40s, joints, thickened muscles, scarred reflexes, still sharp but edged with pain, From the first campaigns on Geonosis to the last scattered missions against separatist holdouts, every year of war pressed down twice as hard in the controlled rain and sterile light of Kamino. This had been a theoretical calculation, an efficient way to raise an army quickly once the fighting ended. That design became a sentence. What happens when soldiers built for endless deployment outlive the war? They were made to fight the answer. For many commandos was a slow unwinding of the only life they had ever known. Over time, fractures that had been ignored in the rush of battle began to speak. Old breaks ached under armor plates. Shrapnel lodged near nerves turned every movement into a reminder for commandos. The damage ran deeper than standard infantry. Their missions demanded repeated insertions into hostile environments, zero visibility drops on worlds from Ryloth's dust to the toxic haze of Scarco Minor, prolonged exposure to heavy armor and full gear compressed spines and ground shoulders raw. What followed was a pattern of accumulated strain, micro-injuries from breaching charges, concussive waves from close detonations, nerve trauma from experimental weapons, each on its own survivable together. They aged a body faster than any Kaminoan growth tank. Yet the physical burden was only half the weight carried by these elite squads. The story of the Commandos was written in memories that did not fade when the blaster fire stopped. Every fallen brother left a gap in the formation that never quite closed. There were the clean deaths in open combat, and the darker ones, missions that blurred the line between the light side and the dark side. Assassinations, political disappearances, operations where the target wore the armor of an ally, and the orders came stamped with Republic authority. The moral certainty drilled into them on Kamino eroded in the face of those assignments. By the early Imperial years, the galaxy had shifted around them. Civilians moved on new uniforms, replaced old insignia, but the Commandos carried entire campaigns in their heads. Rex Wolf and Gregor offered a glimpse of what aging out of war meant for those who refused to vanish into Imperial ranks, hiding on a remote world. They traded the constant hum of starships for the creak of a fishing net and the quiet splash of water. Yet even there, the war never fully released its hold. Wolf's paranoia, the scars on Rex's face, Gregor's fractured mind all spoke to battles that continued long after the last order was given. When they returned to fight alongside the early rebel cells, their participation was not a simple revival of former glory. It was an echo, older bodies pushing through pain to answer one more call. Their choice to stand with a new generation against the Empire would shape how Clone legacy was remembered, not merely as instruments of a fallen Republic, but as veterans who tried to correct what had been twisted as the conflict around them began to transform into something larger and more diffuse. Their story slowed from immediate action to reflection, shifting from missions accomplished to questions of meaning, memory, and what it truly meant for manufactured soldiers to leave any trace at all in galactic history. Echoes in the Force, how the Commandos' actions shaped the galaxy as their missions slowed and the war grew stranger. A quieter realization emerged. The grand sieges and starfighter duels that filled the holonet were only half the story. The other half unfolded in shadow, where 4 soldiers in painted armor could decide the fate of entire sectors far from the front lines. Power shifted in silent corridors and forgotten factories throughout the Clone Wars. Many of the Republic's most celebrated victories depended on operations that never reached official records. A droid army might seem to crumble under the weight of Jedi strategy, but somewhere behind that triumph stood a commando squad that had already sabotaged the foundries supplying its weapons. What followed was a pattern repeated across the galactic conflict: surgical strikes that made grand offensives possible, then vanished beneath more glamorous reports on worlds dense with industry. Teams slipped into droid factories and turned the Separatists' strength against them. One demolished assembly line on Geonosis meant thousands fewer battle droids on distant battlefields. A single overload of a reactor on a nameless moon would shape the casualty lists of campaigns fought months later. The story of the war's great turning points often began with a demolition charge placed in perfect silence elsewhere. Commandos hunted the minds behind the machines when Separatist leaders disappeared in the night or were captured in transit. Republic briefings credited Jedi insight and Republic intelligence, yet in truth it was frequently a handful of clones cutting through security, disabling escort droids, and extracting targets whose absence fractured entire offensives. The removal of one logistics coordinator could strand fleets, starve armies, and bend the momentum of the war toward Coruscant other times. Their work never touched an enemy commander at all instead. It wrapped around fragile lifelines that held the Republic together. Convoys guarded through pirate-infested lanes, communications arrays defended on remote asteroids, and medical stations protected during surprise raids all ensured that the Republic could survive long enough for its more visible heroes to act the defense of a single supply line. Could mean that a besieged world received reinforcements rather than falling into darkness over time. Some Jedi generals and Republic strategists understood how indispensable these hidden soldiers had become. Quiet commendations, private debriefings, and rare unguarded thanks hinted at an awareness that the war's balance rested on their shoulders. But when the Republic fell and the Empire rose, the narrative changed. Imperial propaganda elevated the Emperor, his admirals, and his dark enforcers, while the Commandos' contributions dissolved into classified archives and redacted mission logs. The irony was stark. The same skills that preserved the Republic's fragile democracy were effortlessly repurposed to secure Imperial rule. The Empire did not discard its most efficient instruments. It refined them. Sabotage turned to suppression, hostage rescues to targeted arrests, and protection of key routes to the enforcement of blockades tools, once wielded in the name of the light side, now served the cold machinery of an empire built on fear and beneath the famous events of the films and series. Their unseen presence lingers. How many successful Jedi escapes depended on a power conduit already severed by unknown hands? How many battles were won because a nameless commando squad had quietly removed one crucial obstacle in the dark? As the story of the Clone Commandos continues, the next question becomes unavoidable. Whose lives and whose destinies were quietly rewritten by soldiers history never learned to name? Myths, games, and novels. The Republic Commando legacy in our world. In the quieter corners of galactic history, some of the most enduring legacies are not forged on real battlefields at all. They are born instead in stories told in the dark, in games and novels that imagine what a soldier's life might have felt through the eyes of a single squad. The story of the Clone Commandos in the modern era begins in 2005 with a game that would shape how many fans saw these soldiers forever. Around the time of the prequel films, the Republic Commando video game stepped into that space between the Grand Armies and the Jedi generals and narrowed the view to just 4 helmets: Delta Squad. What followed was a slow, immersive descent into the world of tight-knit 4-man teams moving through Geonosian hives, derelict starships, and shadowy separatist facilities. The perspective was close, the chatter constant, the missions brutal yet methodical. For many, this was the first time clones felt less like faceless units and more like weary professionals sharing dark humor amid the noise of war over time. That foundation deepened through the Republic Commando novels by Karen Travis, where the focus shifted even further inward away from strategy maps and toward hearts, languages, and loyalties. These books folded Mandalorian culture into the clones' lives, the way of the Mando, a harsh code of family honor and chosen bonds, quietly wrapped around commandos who had never been meant to have families at all. Training sergeants with Mandalorian roots gave them songs, armor customs, even a new vocabulary for brotherhood and loss. In those pages, the conflict was not only blaster fire and boarding actions, it was the slow realization that these men were property to the Republic, yet persons to each. Other questions of the Force and the Jedi hovered at the edges, as some commandos wondered whether the light side that claimed to defend peace could truly justify an army bred for sacrifice. This was not the Empire yet, but its shadow was already there, in contracts, ownership, and orders that could not be refused. Although much of this material now rests in Legends continuity, its impact endures the inner lives given to squads such as Omega, and the scattered commandos around them would shape how countless fans imagined every clone behind a visor. Even those never named on screen became in the imagination. tired veterans with private rituals, nicknames and memories of Mandalorian lullabies heard once on Kamino canon, in turn has nodded back. Delta Squad's brief appearance in the Clone Wars series, a silent formation in white and blue armor, and the long arc of Gregor, the Commando thought lost, then found again in Star Wars Rebels, both stand as small, bright threads linking game and page to screen. They suggest that even as timelines shift, the spirit of these soldiers continues. In the end, whether labeled canon or legends, these tales form a shared dream, a collective meditation on who the Commandos were and what their lives might have felt from the inside. And as the march of continuity moves forward, another question waits in the shadows: which forgotten squad will be the next to step quietly back into the light? Quiet corners of the galaxy, imagining unrecorded commando fates. And in that quiet question, another path slowly opens a path that leaves the official records behind and drifts into the uncharted spaces between stars far from the core, far from the glow of major hyperlanes. There are backwater worlds where the war never had a name there. The story of the Clone Commandos continues in whispers and in small, unremarkable lives. Imagine a weathered mechanic on a dust-blown frontier moon, his gait still disciplined, his eyes still scanning exits. Without thinking to the locals, he is only another drifter repairing haulers and agri-droids. But beneath the worn coveralls survives the training of Kamino and the muscle memory of 1,000 live fire drills on another forgotten world. A solitary hunter tracks game through misty forests, his armor long since traded for patchwork leather and scavenged plate. Yet every movement speaks of drilled precision blaster held at just the right angle, breath measured in the scope's reflection. At night he sits by a small fire, staring into the embers as if watching old missions replay in the dark elsewhere. A cargo loader in some rusting orbital station moves crates with unerring efficiency, never tiring, never complaining over time. Rumors spread among deckhands that this anonymous laborer once fought in the Clone Wars. The truth remains unspoken, but the way he freezes at the sound of distant artillery in a holodrama suggests more than simple imagination. Not every commando vanished alone in some quiet corners of the galaxy, foreman. Squads remained intact, their formation transformed into a tiny family in shadowed cantinas on remote trade posts. Brothers sit around dented metal tables, armor repainted in civilian colors or hidden beneath cloaks. They speak softly in Kamino and training slang, sharing stories of instructors long gone, of simulation rooms filled with rain and thunder, and of battlefields that official reports never mentioned. What followed was not glorious victory, but a slow adjustment to peacetime that never truly arrived. In some settlements, far from any Empire garrison, commandos became local shields rather than Imperial blades. A retired sergeant organizes a town militia, teaching farmers to brace a blaster properly and to fortify their homes against raiders. Another contracts as a mercenary, but chooses clients carefully, taking jobs that protect convoys of refugees or defend small communities from pirates and slavers. Their skills, once bound to a galactic conflict, now focused on single villages, single families, single lives for many of them. The war never really ended. It simply changed shape. The enemy became memory and silence. Instead of droids and battle tanks, in cramped bunk rooms above cheap inns, they wake before dawn, heart racing to the echo of shouted orders that no longer exist in crowded markets. They instinctively count exits and assess threats. The search for meaning replaces the chain of command, and the only orders that remain are the ones they give themselves over time. These unrecorded fates drift beyond canon and legends into a softer, open space where imagination takes command. No archivist can track every commando who slipped through the cracks of the new order. No chronicle can capture each small act of courage or each quiet surrender to anonymity in that vast, uncharted region of possibility. Another question forms in the dark. If some of these hidden soldiers were to step forward again in a changing galaxy, whose cause would they choose to fight for next? Cycles of creation and control. What the Commandos reveal about the Republic. In that question, another truth slowly comes into focus. Power does not only reveal itself in grand battles or in the rise and fall of empires. Sometimes it appears in laboratories and training halls where sentient beings are designed for a purpose. Before they ever take a breath, the story of the Clone Commandos is one of those quiet revelations, a mirror held up to the Republic itself. From the moment Kamino and cloners were commissioned to create not just an army, but specialized elites, the Republic crossed a threshold. The decision to order commandos was a decision to manufacture minds and bodies tuned for infiltration, demolition, and silent killing. Their enhanced reflexes, their modified genetics, their upbringing in tight four-man squads all spoke to an unsettling premise. These were not citizens volunteering for war. They were assets grown for tasks too dangerous, too secret, or too morally fragile to entrust to ordinary troops. What followed was an era in which the Republic's most delicate problems could be solved by soldiers who had never been allowed to imagine another life. Standing beside this program were the Jedi Guardians of Peace, who now depended on warriors bred for conflict over time. This reliance carved a deep contradiction into the order on the surface. Jedi generals fought with compassion, leading men they called brothers into battle. Beneath that idealism lay a quieter acceptance that Clone Commandos would perform the missions. No Jedi Council report would ever fully describe raids in the dark sabotage behind enemy lines, targeted eliminations that blurred the boundary between defense and aggression. Many Jedi felt unease, yet the war continued, and with it their complicity within the squads themselves. Another struggle unfolded. The Commandos were trained as property, yet they bonded as people. They gave each other names. They decorated armor with symbols of pride and memory. They mourned fallen brothers, even as official records reduced those losses to numbers and cost assessments. In this tension between individual humanity and systemic control, the Commandos became living contradictions. They were friends and family to one another, but to the structures that commanded them, they remained equipment to be deployed, replaced, and written off. When the Republic shifted into the Empire, that transformation did not invent this dynamic. It simply stripped away the last layers of illusion, the same genetic conditioning, the same secrecy, the same readiness to treat sentient lives as programmable tools now served an openly authoritarian regime. Commandos who once guarded senators or rescued civilians found themselves hunting dissidents, training new enforcers, or vanishing into classified Imperial projects. The line between Republic and Empire blurred in their experience, revealing how long the foundations of control had been in place. Yet even in this darker phase, the presence of the Commandos hints at something gentler beneath the machinery of war. Their capacity for loyalty, for small acts of defiance, for bonds that outlasted orders, suggest that no system, however rigid, can fully command the force that moves within a thinking mind. As the galactic story turns toward quieter years and scattered survivors, the echo of those engineered soldiers softens, becoming less a sharp accusation and more a lingering question about creation duty and the fragile space where choice might still emerge. Softly, through the timeline, a slow recap of the Commando's journey, as the echo of those engineered soldiers softens, the story of the Clone Commandos can be traced again from the beginning, not as a series of sharp battles, but as a single long breath drawn in the rain on Kamino. The training halls there were polished and bright, yet the skies above were endless, grey storms. Four-man squads moved through obstacle courses in perfect sync, their world reduced to the rhythm of boots on metal, the weight of armor on growing shoulders, and instructors' voices promising a war none of them had yet seen. In those early years, their entire universe was brothers and orders, each commando learning to read the other's movements without words. Delta, Omega, and countless unnamed units drilled until their separate thoughts blurred into one intent. They fired as one, advanced as one, and in the rare quiet moments between simulations, they traced small marks on armor or adjusted gear in tiny gestures of individuality that would shape how they carried themselves into the wider galactic conflict. When the Clone Wars finally erupted, the transition from simulation to battlefield came almost without a scene. Geonosis, with its burning skies and choked dust, became their first great crucible. Commandos moved beneath the chaos of the main assault, slipping through tunnels and hive corridors, while above them walkers burned and gunships fell. What followed was a campaign of shadows across the outer rim from ruined, listening posts to frozen outposts from the Citadel's brutal prison corridors, to silent insertions on worlds the Senate would never name. Each mission added another layer of scars and another quiet doubt about the cost of victory over time. Their paths crossed Jedi generals and standard clone legions, the Commandos watching from the edges as luminous blades cut through smoke, and regular troopers held the lines that they themselves had softened in the dark side of the war. Some Jedi tried to see the men beneath the helmets. Others saw only assets to be deployed and retrieved, yet in shared foxholes and exfiltration zones. A few brief conversations about the Force destiny and choice hinted that something more than programming might be stirring behind mirrored visors. The turning point arrived with a single coded transmission. Order 66 transformed loyalty into a weapon. The same conditioning that bound squads together was turned outward against their former allies. In an instant, the Republic. They had bled for dissolved into an empire, and their hard-earned skills were quietly repurposed to enforce a new dark order. Some Commandos became Imperial hunters, tracking surviving Jedi through ruined temples. Others would decommission their armor, stored away, as if the history written into each scratch could be archived and forgotten in the years that followed. The fates of these soldiers scattered. Gregor vanished in fire, only to reappear decades later in the Age of Rebellion, his fractured memory and weathered armor, a living reminder that the war had never fully ended. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history only in the smallest of ways. Yet it suggested that even a single rescued commando could alter the path of resistance. And as the galaxy moved on from clones to conscripts, from Jedi to insurgents, the question lingered in the quiet spaces between stars. What else survived from those rain-soaked halls, waiting to step out of the shadows once more? A thread of armor in the wait seemed dark. The Commandos' lasting legacy. In the quiet years that followed the fall of the Republic, the story of the Clone Commandos did not end. It simply slipped beneath the surface of galactic history. Power shifted from Senate to Empire, from Jedi to Sith, and then back toward the light side again. Yet in the shadows, between those great movements, small echoes remained, armor scuffed by forgotten campaigns, names spoken only in half-remembered debriefings. Despite their relative obscurity in mainstream tales, these soldiers became something more than background figures in a larger war. They emerged as symbols of quiet heroism, of sacrifice, carried out without witnesses, of the strange complexity that came from manufactured lives searching for meaning in a galaxy that treated them as expendable assets. The Commandos had been designed for efficiency, yet what followed was a slow awakening to individuality, to preference to fear and hope, and stubborn loyalty that no Kamino and template could fully predict. Over time later, generations of special forces inherited their shadowed legacy. Imperial commandos stalked insurgents in the Outer Rim, their armor and tactics direct descendants of those first squads on Geonosis and Ryloth. Then came units whose very existence would shape fan memory of the clones the Bad Batch, with their mismatched gear, their defiant streaks, and their refusal to remain faceless, were a living reminder that the Republic's perfect soldiers had never truly been identical. Each squad, from Delta and Omega to lone survivors such as Gregor, carried forward the idea that even in a manufactured army, the Force could stir unique paths. This influence extended beyond armor and equipment. It lived in the way stories began to speak of clones as individuals rather than numbers. Once they had been a sea of white helmets advancing through smoke. Now they were brothers with private rituals and quiet jokes. Elite teams moving through dark corridors on Scarco Minor or slipping unseen. Across ruined bridges at the Citadel, fans remembered specific voices, specific helmets, specific choices, and in doing so, reshaped how the entire war was understood again and again. One image returned, 4 armored figures moving through darkness perfectly, in sync, unseen by most, yet carrying the weight of entire campaigns on their shoulders. It did not matter whether the mission was a sabotage run on a separatist foundry, or an extractions under a storm-lashed Kaminoan sky. The pattern was the same silent approach, controlled bursts of power, then disappearance into the night. This became a lasting metaphor for hidden effort, for unacknowledged courage that never reached the HoloNet headlines. Remembering the Commandos became a quiet act of respect, an acknowledgement that every great conflict in galactic history rests on countless unseen hands. In fiction and in reality, there are always lives that never make it into official records, uncredited sacrifices that hold the line, while others claim the victory. And as this long march through their campaigns begins to slow, the narrative itself softens the pace, eases the repetitions grow gentler. Names blur into a steady rhythm of squads and brothers and distant worlds, until it is safe to let the armor fade into the dark and allow the listener to drift with them into rest, because somewhere out there in the vast night of the galaxy, the last echoes of their footsteps still move in formation, and the war for memory grows quiet at last, drifting off with the squad, final reflections and gentle farewell. In that quiet, the scene shifts one final time to a transport bay, adrift between stars. The hull hums with a low constant vibration. The deck glows with faint emergency strips, and a single overhead lumen throws soft shadows across stacked crates and armored forms. Here, a commando squad sits with helmets off backs, resting against cold durasteel shoulders, touching or nearly touching. No briefing, no mission clock, counting down only the shared silence of brothers who have given everything they were engineered to give and have a little more left than anyone expected. The story of these soldiers begins in rain and floodlights on Kamino, but it settles here, in this dim hold where the war is distant and the voices are low, each scar on a shaved scalp, each streak of paint on battered armor marks the small sparks of individuality that Kaminoan design never intended, yet could not erase. Over time, those markings became more than decoration. They became proof that even in a manufactured army, the Force found room for difference around them. The echoes of training halls, Geonosian dust, the Citadel's cold walls, and the shattered streets of Reloth blur into a single long corridor of memory. What followed was years of missions carried out in the shadows, while the grand armies clashed in the open Delta Squad, on derelict hulks, Omega, weaving through urban ruins, lone survivors, like Gregor, lost and then found again on forgotten worlds each. Operation would shape not only battles, but the fragile identities hidden behind identical faces. Brotherhood and duty sat side by side in this quiet bay. One born from Kaminoan programming and Republic command, the other grown in stolen jokes, shared rations and the steady presence of a voice on the squad channel, even as the galactic conflict twisted toward Order 66 and the rise of an empire. The bond between these soldiers remained something the dark side could not fully rewrite. In this final moment, names ranks. Designations begin to soften. The exact sequence of campaigns becomes less important than the rhythm beneath them. The soft thud of armored boots in a corridor, the distant suggestion of rain against a gunship hull, the slow, steady breathing of 4 commandos drifting toward sleep, with rifles within reach, but helmets resting idle at their sides. The long journey from first drills in sterile white rooms to scattered fates under Imperial insignia narrows now to sensation rather than detail. The tension in a shoulder easing against a brother's armor, the low murmur of a half-finished story fading into silence, the subtle sway of a ship that has weathered too many jumps and too many wars. As the transport glides through the dark, the war in their memories becomes a muted backdrop. The light side and dark side, the Jedi and the Sith, the rise and fall of Republic and Empire, all recede, until only this small circle of exhausted soldiers remains. Let the specifics of missions and designations drift away. Let the timeline blur until it is only a gentle current carrying these brothers through the night. And if the story continues beyond this quiet bay, it can unfold softly in dreams, a lingering march of armored silhouettes moving into a horizon where no orders call them back and no conflict waits on the other side of the ramp. If you wake again, continuing the journey and where to go next, If awareness drifts back for a moment, if the rhythm of breath settles and the mind surfaces just enough to notice these words, there is still more of this galactic history waiting in the dark, quiet between the stars. The story of the Clone Commandos does not end with the last mission fading into silence. It simply narrows to a calm point and then stretches outward again into other paths, other brothers, other wars. Some paths run straight through Delta Squad, each operation a slow, deliberate step through the Clone Wars and beyond. There can be a full, unhurried walkthrough of their campaign, beginning on the rain-soaked platforms of Kamino, moving through the shattered spires of Geonosis, and into the shadowed corridors of derelict ships. Every breach, every coded transmission, every moment of forced patience between bursts of violence can be traced in order. What followed was not only a record of battles, but of a small unit, learning exactly how far loyalty could be pushed before something within began to resist. Other paths turn toward Omega Squad, a quieter theater where the main terrain is the mind rather than the battlefield there. The focus can rest on psychology and brotherhood, on how enhanced soldiers trained from birth to obey begin to question the commands that define them. Over time, a slow chronicle can follow their doubts, their small acts of defiance, their attempts to build identities beyond serial numbers and armor plates, in that telling the conflict with the dark side is not a clash of sabers, but a struggle to hold on to compassion in a war that rewards only efficiency. Far ahead in the timeline, another thread waits in the aging faces of Gregor Rex and the scattered veterans of the Rebellion era. Their story would shape the understanding of what happens when an army built for a single war survives past its purpose. The armor does not fit as easily. The march is not as smooth yet. The instinct to protect remains a quiet constant. A dedicated episode can move slowly through abandoned outposts, forgotten Imperial records and lonely cargo holds, where old helmets gather dust while the stars continue their indifferent rotation for those still awake enough to choose a direction. There is no urgency. The next step can be as simple as letting another long-form chronicle queue in the background, or leaving a calm note about which squad or which commander should be followed into the dark next. Even a silent gesture of subscribing is only another file added to an archive, a way of marking that these histories of soldiers and empires still matter somewhere in the galactic night, whether attention lingers here or sleep closes in. Completely, the stories remain unchanged. They wait on standby for the next 1,000 years, patient as a squad in a dimmed hangar, the lights of a Republic gunship lowering to a soft glow armor stacked neatly beside narrow bunks, rifles locked away, safeties engaged, and above it all, beyond steel and atmosphere, the endless rain of Kamino continues to fall steady and soothing, a distant curtain of water drawn gently over the days. War until only the sound of it remains.